1985, the Detroit Mafia cleans house. At least 10 different homicides in Metro Detroit during 1985 bore the signs of being mob-related, including 2 different triple murders. In 1984, the FBI had estimated the family's strength at less than 40 members, so perhaps 1985 was another year in which the proverbial books were opened and new members brought into the family by making their bones. Perhaps the rash of killings were related to Tony Giacalone's impending release from federal prison early the following year. And no murder was more important than that of Pete Cavataio, up-and-coming soldier in the family and brother-in-law to the infamous Corrados.
Standing here in the shadow of the Ambassador Bridge, in the Delray section of the southwest portion of Detroit. In July of 1985, the last made member of the Detroit Mafia to be killed, Pete Cavataio, his body was found on a street not far away from here. Cavataio married into the Corrado family. He married the daughter of Machine Gun Pete Corrado. His brother-in-laws were Dominic Fats Corrado and Anthony Tony the Bull Corrado. Cavataio at one point in the 1960s was viewed as a future leader of the Detroit mob. However, that did not pan out. Cavataio's temper proved a bugaboo, as well as his penchant for sleeping with certain members' wives and girlfriends.
Pete Cavataio, to me, was a low-class guy. I mean, he's dead now, God bless him, but you know.
Cavataio's body was found on Harvey Street, battered and tortured. Bullet in the back of his head, as well as several wounds from a heated knife being plunged into his body in order to try to reveal the whereabouts of a safe where members of the Detroit mob thought he was holding some money that he had possibly stolen. The Cavataio homicide went cold until the early 1990s, when a Giacalone crew member by the name of John Pree was arrested for a home invasion.
John Pree was running buddies with Carlo Bomarito, son of Frank Bomarito, who had been convicted several years earlier for conspiring to murder Ernie Kanakis, and together they had been embroiled in various escapades, such as being accused of committing arson against a sanitation company that refused to cooperate. Pree's home invasion arrest included Bomarito as a co-defendant. The two were accused of robbing an Oakland County heroin dealer on the orders of the Giacalone brothers.
Pree, for a short period of time, turned government witness, debriefed the FBI, and admitted to playing a role in the Cavataio murder on the instructions of the Giacalone brothers. Pree eventually recanted his testimony, and the case was never brought to trial, and no charges were ever filed.
While Pree was convicted, Bomarito was cleared of the charges.
Pree to this day is still in prison on the home invasion charge, and the Cavataio murder, although not officially solved, in the minds of the FBI, they have a pretty good idea of who did it and how it went down. So when we talk about the Detroit mob and their penchant for gangland homicides, I think that you can make a parallel between kind of the reputation as an entity, as a whole syndicate, as being very under the radar and low key and very business savvy, to the way they actually go about on their enforcement and their murders, where that a lot of their murders are very under the radar and very suspicious and very lots of conjecture. Was it a murder? Was it a suicide? Was it an overdose?
Yes. And they do have that reputation as being like one of those least violent mafia families in the United States. In my research, I haven't really found that to be completely true.
And that's really kind of what we were saying before. I mean, they're able to put a veneer over it, which really kind of leaves question about whether it was a murder, whether it wasn't.
Yes, whether it was a suicide, whether it was a drug overdose, whether it was an accident, things like that definitely seems to be a method of operations for the Detroit mob, because it's statistically unlikely that this number of people would die in these bizarre circumstances.
And they're very good at covering their tracks. I mean, no modern-day member of the Detroit Mafia, nor anyone for at least over 50 years has ever been charged or gone to jail for a mob-related murder. When was the last?
The last one that happened was in 1934, and that was.
So it's been, 80 years, almost 80 years since a member of the Detroit Mafia has actually gone away for a murder.
Somebody will end up dead, and they'll end up surfacing, and we have strong belief that it was possibly a mob-related hit. Hasn't been a bunch of that because, again, coming out from our shop with regards to convictions, it's a pretty tight-lipped family. If they don't know you, you're just not going to be privy to that.
By now, sports gambling had become the lifeblood of the Detroit Mafia, serving as a nexus point for both loan sharking and extortion operations on area gamblers.
I have actually seen a check written by one gambling victim who lost $1 million. That's a single check, which cleared, by the way. This was a legitimate businessman who lost on one bet on the Super Bowl $1 million.
It's the summer of 1990, and the Detroit Pistons are getting ready to win back-to-back NBA championships. But Pistons star Isaiah Thomas was embroiled in a media frenzy that centered around allegations of his involvement in an Alan Hilf-led gambling ring.
It was a status symbol when you would have games at, let's say, for instance, Tommy Hearn's house in Southfield or Isaiah Thomas's house in Bloomfield Hills, which were two locations that were implicated in an indictment in 1990, in which Salem was said to have been running high-profile, very high-stakes craps games in the basement of both Hearn's and Thomas's house.
A local attorney subpoenaed in the case testified that these elite gambling parties were frequented by a mostly black and Middle Eastern clientele of drug dealers, liquor store owners, and professional athletes.
The indictment broke on the eve of the Detroit Pistons repeating as NBA champions in 1990.
Thomas's name came to light when it was revealed that his neighbor, grocery store owner Emmett Denha, had cashed over $100,000 in personal checks for Thomas.
What happened was Denha had a market where he was able to get large sums of cash, and the LCN figures used Denha's market to take the gambling proceeds and convert them into cash.
Emmett wanted to be liked by a lot of people, and I don't think the feeling was mutual. I think he was being used. They took advantage of that because he was a degenerate gambler. They probably gave him a break on some of his losses, and he cashed checks for him, cashed very big checks, and he got into trouble for it. So.
Isaiah Thomas was cleared of any wrongdoing, but Denha, along with Alan Hilf, Jackie Giacalone, and Billy Giacalone, were all indicted and convicted.
When Billy Giacalone was convicted of tax evasion, what happened was Giacalone and his lawyer, D.D. Loren, received money from an individual by the name of Al Allen. He wrote a large number of checks. Those checks were then given to Denha, who ran them through his supermarket, converted the checks into cash, gave the checks to Jack Giacalone, who in turn passed them along to his father.
It was a bloodless hit carried out by federal agents heavily armed with arrest warrants. The FBI today busted the leaders of Detroit's Mafia. It's the FBI's latest attack on organized crime in America's big cities. But despite the crackdown, the top FBI official says what he calls the Cosa Nostra remains, and I quote, the most significant organized crime threat in America.
They were easily one of the most successful mafia families left in America until today.
They're saying you guys are big players in the mafia. Is that true?
Your father is.
The Gam Tax case was the first real chance for the federal government to dismantle the Detroit family like they had been doing to mob families all across the country during the late 80s and early 90s.
The U.S. Attorney's Office here in the Eastern District of Michigan, I believe it was in March of 1996, brought down a multi-count indictment on the majority of what was alleged to have been the hierarchy of the Detroit family of the Cosa Nostra.
In coordinated raids, the FBI swooped up 17 members of the Detroit chapter of La Cosa Nostra, including all its top leaders.
We're taking out the whole hierarchy, and that's what the significance of this particular investigation is. The 9 of the people arrested were made members, were the historical leadership of this family for the past 30 years.
In the case of Gam Tax, we targeted the Detroit organized crime family, and we dealt with criminal activity dating back as far as the mid-60s, all the way up to the date of the indictment, which was the mid-90s.
The Detroit mob did it the old-fashioned way, the Justice Department said, by bombing some businesses into submission, extorting others, and even making a run at controlling the clubs in Las Vegas.
The big break for the government came through the incompetence of 2 of the family's soldiers, Novi Tocco and Paul Corrado. Tocco and Corrado, despite their infamous last names, were still working the streets, and in the mid-90s decided to organize their own numbers racket extortion ring.
They decided that they were going to generate some income collecting a tribute from bookmakers and numbers runners who were operating in the Detroit area. They were going to take a monthly or bi-weekly payment from these guys in order to be allowed to run a numbers business or run a bookmaking business.
This is street tax shakedown
Right,
scam.
right. There were a lot of them that were Middle Eastern, and they went to them and they said, if you want to continue to function and continue to run your business, you've got to pay us for the opportunity to do that.
But soon after they started shaking down mostly Middle Eastern bookmakers and numbers runners, their car was bugged, and Novi Tocco and Paul Corrado talked themselves and the rest of the family straight into prison.
They complained about the hierarchy of the LCN not giving them a chance to make money, that they had theirs and they didn't care about the little guys who were trying to make their way. They, at one point in time, they were having difficulty collecting from a particular bookmaker, so they discussed either setting off a bomb in the parking lot of his business on Michigan Avenue. They ultimately decided to shoot a gun through his window.
Now, Tony's really once again got in trouble in the 1990s, along with the whole family in the Gamtax bust, but what was specifically disturbing to Jack Tocco and the rest of the administration was that Tony Zerilli was actually caught on tape, on surveillance, audio surveillance coming out of cars being driven by his nephew, Novi Tocco, and cousin Paulie Corrado. Jack is someone who is notoriously very hard to get on audio surveillance, and someone who's probably only been picked up by the FBI audio surveillance people less than a dozen times in his whole career. Tony Zerilli has not been so lucky and has been caught on tape several times, including the Gamtax bust.
I think the fact that Novi is his nephew, that he approved Novi's activities, that he authorized what Novi did, and that he himself was ultimately caught on tape discussing with Novi taking action against the civilian, not a person in any way directly involved in the LCN, all caused people to say, but for Novi Tocco and his uncle Anthony Zerilli, we might not be here in this particular case and under indictment.
Jack Tocco later blamed Zerilli in large part for the Gamtax convictions, and Zerilli's criminal career came to a dead end after 50-plus years as a made man.
As I said before, Zerilli did a jail term, and when he came out last April, he's been persona non grata with the Detroit Mafia. Rumor on the street is that Jack Tocco was so upset with him for his behavior, he's taken his stripes away, knocked him down from underboss, and put him on the shelf. Tony Zerilli's been walking around town kind of not in the best of light, looking for money. Jack Tocco apparently won't take his calls, and Tony Zerilli's not really at the point that I think he thought he'd be, sitting here in his 80s now. And it really kind of tells the story of two first cousins in Jack Tocco and Tony Zerilli, and kind of the paths that they both took. And as we are today, Tony Zerilli's really not in the fold anymore. Jack Tocco's still on top. It really tells the whole story.
Boss Jack Tocco, his brother Tony, along with Anthony the Bull Corrado, Big Paulie Corrado, and Novi Tocco, all went to trial in 1998. With the exception of reputed consigliere Tony Tocco, who was believed to have taken over as acting boss when his older brother Jack was sentenced to time in prison, all the main targets of the Gamtax prosecution were convicted.
But each one of the 3 counts on which Jack Tocco was convicted, 2 RICO counts and a conspiracy to commit extortion, each carried a 20-year maximum sentence.
Jack Tocco had been found guilty by the jury of being the head of the Detroit Cosa Nostra family and directing and allowing his subordinates to carry out various criminal activities dating back into the 1960s.
The trial judge in the case of Jack Tocco elected to give him 1 year and 1 day in prison.
Tocco's lenient sentence shocked the government. Federal prosecutors appealed the sentence 2 different times with little result, and Tocco ultimately served less than 3 years in prison.
All the other defendants who were convicted, Novi Tocco, Paul Corrado, and Dominic Corrado, and ultimately Tony Zerilli, all received much more significant sentences than that. Novi was able to get an early release because he agreed to cooperate with the government, but Jack Tocco got a relatively minor sentence, much less than would be suggested by a person whom the jury determined to be the head of the family and the person responsible for all the activities committed by all the other people. But